You're listening to the Unsiloed Podcast with Greg LeBlanc, produced by University FM. Unsiloed is a series of interdisciplinary conversations that inspire new ways of thinking about our world. So wherever you are, enjoy today's episode, and here's your host, Greg LeBlanc.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Vernon Smith, who is emeritus professor of economics and law at Chapman University, and also the author of, well, you've had time to crank out a few books over the years. The most recent book is this one called Economics of Markets, which I think is just now in print. You've got another book I think you're working on around Adam Smith. We've got Rationality in Economics, which came out a few years ago. This one co-authored with Bart Wilson on Humanomics. And of course, we've got the two-volume memoir, A Life in Experimental Economics, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Welcome, Vernon.
Gregory, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So look, throughout your work, you talk about two different types of rationality and two different types of economics. And when I teach courses like game theory, I find myself having to toggle back and forth between the standard model, the neoclassical model, the one of complete rationality, homo economicus, and so forth, and then the sort of behavioral game theory or behavioral economics. And these two approaches, I mean, they're echoed even in Adam Smith's original two books. Hayek, of course, talked about the two different types of rationality. And I think what you've been trying to do in recent years is to come up with a more unified approach to human behavior and social sciences. And indeed, you argue that Adam Smith didn't think of those two books as describing two completely different parts of human nature.
No, these two books were written by the same person, and I would argue are very much in the same thinking style. And one of the things that I tell students, and also in public lectures, is you need to understand that Adam Smith distinguished between the origins of action and the consequences of actions. These were separate in his mind. So he found the origins, for example, in reciprocity in our communities and neighborhoods, in the gratitude that the individual feels when someone does something for them that's good-hearted. I mean, deliberately and intentionally does a good action. So the emotions of reciprocity he sees as coming from gratitude.
But it seems like the profession of economics dug into only a subset of Adam Smith's insights, the ones that are best articulated in The Wealth of Nations, which I guess we could argue make the most sense when we're talking about impersonal interactions in the marketplace. So, I mean, why did economics decide to carve off a subset of human activity and focus on that? And then why did they sort of assume away the rest of human behavior and human sentiments?
I'm not sure I know that why. Why is a difficult question there. But economists do not read the theory of moral sentiments. And listen, when they do, they don't understand it. I mean, I can document that, and I have documented it, where economists, they don't even read the Wealth of Nations. They read into the Wealth of Nations things that are not there. For example, Adam Smith did not champion the self-interest principle in the Wealth of Nations. In fact, he talked about people pursuing their own interest in their own way. Own interest, not selfish interest. Now, that included selfish. And if you read the theory of moral sentiments, you can see why he's using this language.
This is like a stoical self-interest, right?
Yes, and he's very much influenced by the Stoical tradition in philosophy. And in fact, I think basically upgraded that and used it to think about the world in which he lived, because he was very interested in the circumstances that enable people to get along with each other. And this is really a primary objective of humans. And he has a very nice, I would call it a mental experiment that demonstrates how and why we are social. He says, imagine a member of the species being brought up entirely in isolation, separate from any other member of the species. He says that person can no more know what it means for his or her mind to be deformed than his or her face to be deformed. Give that person a mirror, and if you bring him into society, we give him the mirror he needs. So he used this metaphor of the social mirror, you see, that enables us to see ourselves as others see us. And once we begin to see ourselves as others see us, that affects then what we say and do and how we act. And we're very much oriented toward getting along with each other. He uses the phrase, get along with, something like 41 times in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He wants you to get it. And he's a skeptic of utilitarianism because that he sees human action as very much rule governed and governed by the rules that we learn. He says that as soon as when we first have playmates, we start to be subjected to forces outside of our immediate family. And he says our playmates are not going to tolerate our anger and our frustrations as easily as our family does. And so we start to modify how we come off in order to better get along. And I think it's a great way to think about human action. And there's still plenty of room for the self-interest.
So he was already articulating endogenous preferences, right? That preferences, you're not born with these preferences, but rather they're a product of your social interactions.
Yes, and the preferences are other regarding and not own regarding. They're both of these. We look for a balance between being other regarding and own regarding, and that's because we want others to be pleased with us.
But I think he also says that the inclination to engage in truck and barter, this is also something which is a social idea that emerges out of social interactions, that you're not born wanting to engage in commerce.
Yes, and I think that he doesn't really make this point, but I think that the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange comes from what Bart Wilson and I have called his first proposition on beneficence. And here's the proposition. He says actions of a beneficent tendency alone deserve reward because of the gratitude the person feels for these actions. In other words, you do something out of the intentionally that benefits me. Smith says, I feel a debt of gratitude for that. I feel required to reward it. So reciprocity, you see, comes from that. Well, in our communities, the exchange of favors are not simultaneous. They tend to be distributed in time. And you do something that's beneficial to me, and then I, without hardly even thinking about it, implicitly return that favor at a later time. There's the receipt of something favorable, and then there's the return of that, the rewarding of that. Well, with trade and exchange, those come together. You see, you and I, if we trade, each of us simultaneously benefits from that, and each of us simultaneously benefits the other. And the idea there being that two people engage in exchange because they both benefit. What I give up is not as valuable to me as what I receive. And what you give up is not as valuable to you as what you receive. So that draws us into trade. And this has its origins in community and neighborhood, and of course, surely very early had its origins in economic trades, because people love to go to fairs, celebrations. In the Native American community, they were called powwows. I mean, it's kind of universal across human cultures, just in these engagements like this. So Smith sees these things as really a very ancient origins.
Well, I mean, economics has evolved. We now have behavioral economics, and what they've done is they've tried to create more sophisticated preference functions, right, which incorporate other regarding preferences and so forth. And you challenge this. You say that the standard social science model, which has been the initial attempt to account for these things which violate the standard assumptions, that this is inadequate. Why is it inadequate? I mean, doesn't this just help us to make the predictions that we're looking for?
Here's the thing. Are you going to model relationships between people? And in modeling relationships, see, utility theory says, well, if I do something good for you, it must be because the payoff to you is in my utility function. If you do something good for me, it must be because my payoff is in your utility function. But you see, how did it get there? What's the process? What is it about human beings that cause them to value what other people receive and want to reduce the costs and evil done others? You see, and I think that perspective is at the foundation of the theory of moral sentiments. That's what he's talking about, sentiments. An important part of it is fellow feeling. I love the phrase. See, people have this capacity for simultaneous fellow feeling. And that's the way Adam Smith thinks about the fundamental sentiments that bring people together. And I think that, to me, that's what's missing in the modern concept of the individual, who's always pursuing to maximize utility. And if it turns out you find that he does good things for others, well, it must be because those good things are in his utility function. And I just think that's just kind of a sterile way and a mechanical way to think about it. Is Adam Smith found unsatisfactory. I agree with him. It is unsatisfactory. And the thing about experimental economics is that we've kind of discovered this in the lab, you see, that the individual was a much broader decision-making entity than we originally were supposed him or her to be. And so to me, it's natural to return to the kind of the way of thinking and the way of modeling that you find in the theory of moral sentiments. And it's rigorous. I mean, you don't have to give up any modern mathematical rigor.
Well, they say about economists that they're the kind of people who see that something happens in practice and then they have to figure out whether it works in theory. And I think a lot of the insights in behavioral economics, we only really had to spell them out because of this experimental evidence. And it was really experimental economics that forced us to confront these violations of the standard assumptions. So I guess I'm wondering, I mean, why did it take so long for us to use experiments? I mean, every other science has the empirical approach, the theoretical approach, and the experimental approach, but economics for a really long time didn't have any kind of third leg, any kind of experimental arm. Why did it take so long?
Well, there were some they were psychology experiments that kind of all involved economic questions, but they didn't take hold. We weren't really ready for it. You see, my first market experiment was done in January 1956. And that was considered quite unusual. And in fact, people were wondering what I was up to because I was doing experiments, and experiments were not part of economics. And that's where I learned that what's in economics is what economists do. And if they're not doing it, it's not economics. I stumbled on to a method of learning, of testing what I thought I knew in the laboratory, that I just found very exciting, because my first experiment was a supply and demand experiment.
This was at Purdue?
But yeah, a principles class at Purdue. The reason why I did the experiment was that I realized that I didn't know anything, Greg, about the connection between supply and demand theory and what people actually do on the ground. See, what do they actually do? What actions do they take? And how is it? So I decided I'll do this.
Well, it's because in economics, we just skip right to equilibrium, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it isn't we don't have stories. I think we have good ones. We have pretty good stories, but it doesn't go in. It's not at the level of the individual, which is what I wanted to do. So I thought, well, look, I'll do a simple supply and demand experiment. and I'll do it on the first day of my class in January of 1956, before they've read anything, before they've been contaminated by any of the literature. And frankly, I didn't expect it to work anything like it did. I said, wait, now we have this idea of competition. How do I implement that? Well, it occurred to me that if there's any competitive markets anywhere in the world, surely they're in the New York Stock Exchange and the Chicago commodity pits. So I thought I'll go and I'll find out how they trade. So I got an old finance book called The Stock Market by Leffler. And it was terrific because it gave you the details, bids and asks, and how, and I described those rules to the people in my class. I said, now half of you are buyers, and I've given you secret private values. Think of yourself, I didn't have payoffs yet, although I soon introduced actually case payoffs within a matter of weeks. I started to do that. I said, so buyers, think of yourself as making a profit equal to the difference between the value I assigned you and the price at which you buy. And, the lower price you're able to buy from some seller in this room, why the more profit you make. And sellers, think of yourself as making a profit equal to the difference between the price at which you sell and the cost that I've assigned you. So that was the information. Each person only knew their own value or their own cost. They knew nothing about the others, had no idea. So I started this trading with this bid-ask procedure. Well, people sort of felt each other out on either side of the market before the first trade came. And the first trade was below the supply and demand equilibrium, but it wasn't very far. And the next trade was closer, and it tended to converge. And I repeated it. I refreshed their values the second day, and we traded again, refreshed them for the so that's the way I conducted the market. And of course, I was thoroughly familiar with Alfred Marshall. And Marshall's idea was supply and demand is a flow onto and off a market. And so I was getting that notion of a flow by having daily replenishment, holding the conditions of supply and demand constant, and giving that market a chance to equilibrate. Well, it did very quickly. And I found that astonishing. And I remember thinking, there must be something wrong with this experiment. Because you understand, I had been brought up in a theoretical world in which really competitive equilibrium was an abstract ideal. You would only get that if people had complete, perfect information. And here they didn't have complete, perfect, far from it. And yet what they were doing made sense to me. They were feeling each other out. And over time, each side was correcting, trying to do better. And sure enough, it comes into the equilibrium. The problem with that first experiment was it had too much symmetry in it. The supply was just a mirror image of the demand. So the equilibrium price was the average value equal to the average cost. And so I took an asymmetric case. I took a case where the demand was really quite elastic and the supply quite inelastic. I took a rather extreme case. So I did that experiment. It converged too at about 3 or 4 periods. And of course, the first thing that I asked myself was, does this generalize to people other than undergraduates? Is there anything special about these undergraduate students? So at conferences, I would do them with teachers. I'd do them with other faculty members. I would go to other universities. If I was invited to give a talk, I'd go for 3 or 4 days and I would say, can I run some experiments with your students? And all these results were replicated. And others got into the picture. Charlie Holt was an early person, Charlie Plott at Caltech, Mark Isaac, who was a student of Charlie Plott's, Betsy Hoffman came from Caltech. They all got into doing experiments. And so in no time at all, we had a community. And that community was powerful. Listen, we just learned so much from each other, as well as from the students. And pedagogically, I realized that this is the way to teach. Instead of me learning stuff and then going in and lecturing what I've learned, why don't I involve the students directly in the learning? You see, and students listen, their diversity and their backgrounds bring a certain richness that come to the classroom, you see, if you use this style of learning. So that locked me into a teaching protocol, you see, as well as a research protocol, and they were the same. There wasn't any difference now between research and teaching. And that's kind of been a dominant theme, in my whole career.
Well, I mean, I think it has definitely changed the way people teach economics. I mean, not everybody, but I certainly use a lot of these tools in my classes, in my game theory class, in my micro class. But I think you mentioned that Ed Chamberlain, who was your teacher at Harvard, he actually did sort of a proto version of this, right, in your class?
Oh, yes. And it was what he did, and I credit him as his method of inducing supply and demand, giving buyers values. That came from Ed Chamberlain. Now, Ed Chamberlain, his books on monopolistic competition, he thought that the competitive model was just nonsense. And so when the experiment he did, he gave people buyers values, sellers cost, and then he had them just circulate in the room. And then he had them come up when a buyer and seller made a trade. He said, come up, give me your value and your cost, tickets that I gave you, and tell me the price that you contracted for. And he'd write that on the board. And then it turns out the prices tend to be below the equilibrium and not converge. And he says, there's your competitive market. You see, it doesn't work. Well, I modified that by the same method of inducing supply and demand, but I had the rules from the double auction. You see, after that breakthrough, people then got interested in the question, well, what other trading institutions and procedures have people used? So we used sealed bids, where everybody puts in one bid, the buyers, you array them from highest to lowest, and then each seller puts in one ask, one offer price, and you array those from lowest to highest, and you cross them, and you feed back to people, okay, this price and this quantity traded. So we started to look at other trading institutions, including what we call posted offer. In ordinary retail markets, you go in and there's the offer, take it or leave it, there's the price. But the interesting thing they're not really just only take it or leave it prices, because in those markets, you had discount traditions. For example, Sears Roebuck used to print a catalog with fixed prices in it. Well, but they had the spring and fall sale catalog. What's that for? It's to correct their mistakes. They made mistakes in pricing. Some things are priced too high, some too low, so they're correcting them. And you have in clothing stores, you have end-of-month clearance sales. You had traditions like that. Modify that fixed, take it or leave it pricing that we call posted offer. So we started to do experiments modeled on the observance of what's going on in those markets. And they're competitive too. They tend to converge more slowly in time than the double auction. That's that's really quick. So these others converge more slowly, but across time, they converge to the supply and demand equilibrium. Very strong tendency to do that. So supply and demand was not some kind of a special, ideal, abstract case. It's driving everything. And to me, it changed completely the way I thought about economics and of markets. And other people who got into that were part of that transformation of our thinking.
It created this whole new discipline of market design. And I think you said at one point that the tools that you had developed for trading impersonally on computers, this was something that you brought to Sperry Rand, and I think you were going to try and get it into the actual markets, and they said they didn't want to they didn't want to use these tools. Is that right?
Well, they were thinking about markets in the same way economists normally did, and they didn't have in mind any sort of idea of finding procedures or studying procedures, you see, that bring buyers and sellers together and facilitate their interaction and the discovery of prices. But you think about how economists model demand. What did they do? They postulate an individual that's maximizing utility, and that person is subjected to a budget constraint. And what's the budget constraint? Well, it's prices. Given prices, you can write down a budget constraint. The sum of the prices times the quantities is equal to my income. And so I have to make my choices subject to that budget constraint. But notice, they're saying given prices. Wait a minute, who's giving prices? There's nobody giving prices. You have to find the prices. They got it wrong right at the beginning. And none of that stuff. Read chapter 7, book 1 of The Wealth of Nations. None of that stuff is in there. He talks about buyers and sellers coming together, and buyers reveal that they implicitly have a willingness to pay restriction on what they will do in the market. Sellers have a willingness to accept. And also, Smith knew about auctions. And I think it's very important. If you search in the Wealth of Nations on the word auction, it comes up in various contexts. And it's clear that he thinks about auctions as indicating that people reveal a maximum willingness to pay. And you see, what do you observe when you go to an auction? Here's an antique couch or painting or vase that's up for sale. And the bidding tends to start low, prices go up. And as the bids get higher, you have fewer and fewer people bidding until finally there's only one person left. And the item is sold to that person. Well, Smith had that model in mind, except that he thought of supply and demand as being a two-sided representation of that. Now, he never articulates it quite in the exact words I just gave you, but I think you can infer that's his thought process from what he says, because he knew that the highest bidder wins. He knew that it was influenced by wealth. He says that people with greater wealth are able and willing to pay more. He had the fundamental elements that enabled him to understand price formation in auctions. And he saw supply and demand in two-sided markets as just a two-sided version of that. And also multiple markets. That is, people were involved in the trading of more than one item. And these might be substitutes or complements. And all of those things he had really a rigorous understanding of.
Well, my favorite experiment that you've done, which I have done repeatedly in my classes, is the famous bubble experiment. And I was wondering, it seems like there was a point in your career where the experiments that you were running were proving and supporting the efficient market hypothesis and price discovery and so forth. And then at some point there was a shift and the experiment started revealing things which were surprising. And I guess what I wanted to know was, what's the role of surprise in scientific discovery? I mean, sometimes you start with a theory and then you set out to demonstrate and prove the theory. But in other cases, it's more like the experiments are the ones that show these anomalies, and then you have to figure out a theory that helps to explain what's going on.
Yes, you see, all of my those supply and demand experiments, the buyers were buying to satisfy their consumption demand, okay? And sellers were selling to satisfy their production supply. And there was people weren't buying and then reselling. So there were no assets involved in any of my early experiments. And Arlington Williams, who developed those original electronic versions of the hand-run experiments, one of our first extensions of the simple supply and demand model was the introduction of traders who could buy in one period and sell in another. And now we looked at a market where the demand was cycling up and down. And these traders were learning to buy in the low price market, carry it over into the high price and resell. And so I remember telling Arlie, I said, Arlie, these guys, they're asset traders. It's an asset to them, and they can both buy and resell. Can we just take that part of the program and create an asset trading environment where we endow people with shares and cash and then study asset market trading? And so that's exactly what he did. So now for the first time, we're introducing assets. And came this big surprise. We're telling everyone that we give them an endowment of shares and cash. At the end of each period, a dividend is declared and paid into the accounts of all the shareholders. So if the dividend is 8 cents and you have 3 shares, you're paid 24 cents. If it's 60 cents, you're paid 3 times 60, $1.20. They were going to trade for 15 periods. And so the first period trading value was 24 times, I think it was 15.
15 times 24.
Yes. So that was the upfront value because you're trading something that's got a right to collect 15 dividends looking forward, you see, the end of period 1, 2. So, and we just calculated that for people and explained it. So you're trading something here that has we call it the fundamental value of $3.60. Well, the trading started out way below that and the first period and started to grow. And within a few periods, it's going through the declining fundamental value each period and going to a much higher price. And so these things were peaking out at really incredibly large prices. And so what is this buying panic? And so now we had something to understand. They were not paying any attention to this fundamental value that we're telling them about. It had nothing to do with what they did. Although what they learned over time was that gradually some of them paid too much, ends up losing. Some sold too low and lost money relative to what they could have. Over time, they were starting to correct and adjust that. So this led to a whole new series of experiments and years of learning, you see, where we're looking at this asset trading. And we introduced forecasts. We asked the subjects to forecast. And in fact, the best forecaster even got a little reward before it. And the interesting thing about the forecast is if things weren't changing very much from period to period, they were pretty good forecasters. But if they were growing, they would tend to lag behind. And then they always miss turning points. So the price would go up, turn, and they're predicting a further increase in the price. Well, Orly and I, we also looked at professional forecasters. They did the same thing. They always missed turning points. Anyway, that just got us into a whole literature on kind of practical aspects of asset trading that we could explore because we had this tool that we could use in the laboratory. And it's really interesting that there is not any such thing as a group that doesn't in the first period. If you do asset trading, they explode. They get carried away. They're basically following a trend. They're trend followers, and they see the trend up, and they continue to follow that, and they go too far. They go too far because the basic economic conditions can't justify that. And so that catches up with them. Bring those people back a second time, and they do much better. Bring them back a third time, and it's very hard for people to bubble. You just don't see them once they get experienced.
Well, you'd be pleased to know that I did a version of this with my colleague, Terry O'Dean, and we did it with a group of very, very successful financial advisors, right? We did this after spending 2 or 3 days explaining the principles of behavioral finance. Just to make sure we got the results we wanted, we exposed them to a short video with car chases and like action music and so forth. And we got the biggest bubble we'd ever seen. It was a lot of fun.
Well, people don't get the economics right by thinking about it. They get it right by actually participating in markets and getting a feel for what's going on. And I argue that humans are very good once they do that. Sure, they can be fooled, and they do a lot of crazy things in a new market. before they've acquired experience, but they adapt very well. And so that equilibrium concepts are relevant, but the behavioral is very much experience oriented. And so they get there through experience, experiential learning, you see, more than just abstract analysis and thinking about it.
Now, you also talked about there's a scandal, right? The Treasury bond scandal in, I think it was 1991 or so. You had anticipated that this was a problem, but for some reason, the regulatory authorities did not pay any attention until this scandal happened. Were you trying to educate the Treasury officials about this?
Well, yes. So had Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman had argued, oh, this is really early. He said that Treasury market, they should be one clearing price. And that's where the array of bids cross the inelastic supply that's been offered. And you clear them all out at that price. Well, there just was no interest in that. The people privileged to bid in the primary Treasury bill dealers, and that's a privileged group of about 12 to 15 companies. And they bid in that market and then retail and then turn around and resell them generally to the public. And they didn't like that idea at all. And then, of course, Milton Friedman suspected there was probably collusion in that market. And then part of his argument was he thought the bids, the various bidders in that market, the bids were too close together. There wasn't enough diversity to be not to, in some sense, there must be something else going on. Well, sure enough, how much longer? 25 years later, what was the company?
Salomon Brothers.
Yes, exactly. They were exchanging information on the bids and they were manipulating it. And moreover, they were bidding for their own account and also bidding for the account of customers, you see. And that's where they were basically arbitraging there. And they got caught by, all of a sudden, they got almost all of an offering because they had a miscalculation a little bit. They got almost the whole. And so an investigation of that revealed that they were manipulating. So that finally brought in the uniform price auction. We finally got it. And that one is really difficult to manipulate because you see there's just one price coming out of that. There's a lot of competition to be that marginal bidder. So if you try to raise your price, you're just likely to lose out to somebody else. So that became the standard way of auctioning. And I think there was great welfare improvement as a result of that. But yeah, we discovered that in a lab a long time, much earlier. But that wasn't enough to convince people.
Well, I was wondering if you could talk about rationality. Right? In this book, Rationality, Economics, you talk about these two different types of rationality. And rationality plays this huge central role in economics, right? We have the axioms of rationality, and whenever we see violations of these axioms, we tend to dismiss the behavior in some way. I mean, why is that? And can we make a case for a more nuanced and complex view of rationality?
Well, again, I think the experimental work on particularly what we call trust games. You see, we started to do trust games about 1988, 1989. Kevin McCabe, and I and Betsy Hoffman were doing these trust games. And the first trust game we did, you're in a room with 11 other people, say, 12 of you. You are matched at random with someone else in the room. And then at random, like a coin flip, you're either the first or second mover and the other person is in the other role. Person one could move right and stop the game, and they each got $10. Or person one could pass to person two. The $20 became $40. Person two now could move right if person one moved to them. And one would get $15 and two get $25, a split of the 40. Or two could move down and take all the money. One gets nothing and two gets $40. So we ran that game. Well, you're going to play this once and only once. You don't know who you're matched with. There's no way to find out who you would get matched with. In fact, we even had a procedure where the experimenter couldn't even identify the individuals who did what. So we were blinded from that. And the subjects knew we were blinded from that. So help me, over half of the person ones move past 2. It's about 55% on average. I'm talking about a large data set now that we build up. Persons 2 at a rate of 2 to 1 choose the 15-25. They cooperate. They do not take all the money. And here it's so easy for them to take all the money. We're inviting them to. They're not doing it. We promise them complete anonymity. They're not doing it. How do we understand that game? Well, I'll tell you what you do. You read Adam Smith, his first proposition on beneficence. He says actions of a beneficent tendency that are properly motivated, and particularly they're deliberate, intentional. He says they alone require reward because of gratitude felt by the recipient. Bart and I read that, and we're teaching Adam Smith. And one day we read that and we realized, wait a minute, that explains the trust game. So person 2, what have you done to me lately? Well, person 1 is just passed to them. And moreover, at great risk, you can take all the money. So are you going to take all the money? No. 2/3 of the people are not going to do that. So here's a guy writing in 1759 that predicts action, predicts the majority action in that game. Now, Bart and I are really impressed by that. What else is this guy talking about that we ought to know about? And I think the theory of moral sentiments is just filled up with gems of wisdom. And notice his propositions, they describe the circumstances, you see.
Context.
The context is important, exactly. So context and circumstances are very important. And the context there is that somebody has done a good-hearted thing for you. Smith says you feel a debt of gratitude. You see, gratitude creates indebtedness. And so people, they may have self-interested motivations, but they also have this motivation to get along with others. And so this proposition predicts in the crust grain that people are sacrificing, they're taking less reward in order to do what they believe is right, to treat this person, you see. Now, if you repeat that game, because there's so much cooperation at the very beginning, it tends to grow quite rapidly. And so you will have, by 20 trials, you have over 90% of the pairs reciprocating, playing the cooperative, and no defection, no one trying to exploit. And basically, Adam Smith would say, well, they've formed a relationship. They don't know who they're anonymously paired with, but they have formed a relationship, and that relationship has been beneficial to them. It's just a way of thinking about human action that's completely foreign to this notion of individual maximization, regardless of consequences that we have in modern economics. And I think behavioral economists, they have tended to explain it with utility theory. And that's Bart and I's criticism of behavioral economics is they're saying, well, having discovered that people are very cooperative, it must be because the other person's payoffs is in the utility function of the first person. And all that's doing is fitting the theory to the empirical finding. You're just saying, well, because economics says people maximize, here's the way we can see that as a maximization problem. But you see, Adam Smith would think that's crazy. You're not listening to the subjects of your science.
Well, you use this term ecological rationality, building on Hayek and Polanyi, I think. And there have been a lot of attempts to unify the social and biological sciences, right? And so a lot of people would use evolutionary theory to explain how this type of behavior would evolve. But I think you argue that, maybe we should focus on human uniqueness, right? So humanomics is basically saying that economics should focus on those things which make humans unique. Do you think that there's a tension there between the desire to biologize economics and this Humanomics project?
Well, the biology also has an important part of evolutionary biology is adaptation, and where species adapt where it has survival properties of adaptation. And I think that's what you're seeing here. It's a value to them to make more for themselves. It's also a value to them to take into account other people's payoffs. If you do things for others in a way, and in fact, it's in Adam Smith, that is returned to you many times over because there's so many people who have a favorable opinion of you. And what your success they see as an important part of friendship and of humans moving together, along together in sort of ecological communities. And of course, on the other side, as Smith emphasizes, you have to have justice, meaning you have to have control over hurtful things that people do to each other. And once those are brought under control, and of the two, of beneficence and justice, he says justice is by far the most important, because he says no society can survive among those people who are always trying to do evil to each other and to benefit from hurting others. So that has to be brought under control. But there's a universal principle here that involves the emotions, that people resent hurtful actions and they want to punish. The reaction is to punish them. He says this is so powerful that the way you would say it in the modern world, he says, that's so powerful that if you bump your head on a beam, sometimes you strike the beam. It's such an automatic response. People want to lash out at hurtful things, even though it's silly to lash out at inanimate objects. So he says that's a built-in thing, and this is where justice comes from, because the desire to punish out of resentment then tends to discourage that. Now, of course, that's hazardous because you could also get it a race to the bottom where each person is trying to punish the other even worse. And so there's instability downward in the punishment procedures. And in fact, Smith argues that, this is why it's very important that the punishment fit the crime. You do not want to punish either too severely or not severely enough. It has to be, that's why it's important to be just right. So the punishment, there has to be kind of a social consensus of that. And for example, he points out that the punishment for theft and robbery is more severe than punishment for violation of contract. See, he has this notion that gains and losses are asymmetric, that the downside is potentially much greater than the upside, which is, of course, that's probably half the work of Kahneman and Tversky.
Prospect theory.
Yeah, prospect theory. Adam Smith has it in 1759, and he uses it to point out that the punishment for theft and robbery is more severe than violation of contract because theft and robbery takes from us what we have already obtained. Violation of contract, he says, only frustrates our expectation of gain. We don't have it yet. Now, that's very sophisticated, and you only get that sophistication with thinking about things the way that Adam Smith did. So that's why I'm a champion of trying to get that pattern of thinking and Adam Smith's principles into the modern way of thinking in economics and psychology and social psychology. Because the theory of moral sentiments was a contribution to social psychology that just never took hold. It was another 100 years, you see, before psychology started to do anything. And it didn't really, and it was really the beginning of the 20th century before psychology became really very prominent. And then it was individual psychology, not social psychology. I think Adam Smith would find that strange.
Well, last question. When you read your memoirs, it's hard not to see the role of community in academic discovery. And leadership, right? Academic leadership. You describe a bunch of communities like the one at Purdue and the one at Arizona, even the one at Harvard where you did your graduate studies. And these were really fertile places for collaboration. And there are certain academic leaders that built these departments and some of whom destroyed these departments. And then there are these non-academic departments, these associations like the Economic Science Association, which I've been to their meetings a bunch of times. I mean, are we in a different era? I mean, it seems like it's almost impossible to create like a Chicago school or Purdue school anymore in the way in which academics is organized today.
Well, yes, but I think we also make up for that to some extent in our associations, our conferences. We have these communities that are outside of the departments and the universities. And I think that's really important. And of course, with experimental economics, I grew up with that. That is, I had people who, once they realized what I was doing and did their own experiments, they became easily as excited as I was. So I made friends, like with Charlie Holt, Charlie Plott, Mark, others that have been lifelong relationships. My most cited paper is with Betsy Halvan and Kevin McKay. And you know what? I couldn't have done that. It wouldn't have been as good paper without Betsy and Kevin. My co-authors are just really extremely valuable to me, and they were. And I discovered that because, you see, I grew up in a world where if you read David Hume, Adam Smith, Alfred Marshall, they tended to be single. They were just single authors. People they didn't have co-authors. Economics was really kind of a lone wolf enterprise. And I think all that changed when I realized, for me in experimental economics, when I realized that I could learn as much as I taught others in co-authorship, and I realized that was true of students. And in the memoir, I describe why and how we went from paper run experiments to electronic, doing them through the monitors of computers. I described that. It happened at Arizona, and it happened in my class because about the second or third week of the class, and people were reading experimental papers and reporting on them, I had an undergraduate student, I remember him very well, Mike Vanoni. He was a junior mechanical engineering student. He wasn't even an economics. And he said, Professor Smith, do you know about this computer system, Plato, over in the library? And I said, no. Well, he said, I think that would be a great way of running these experiments. So I said, well, let's go to the library and see. So where did that technology came from? It came from the students. It didn't come from me. And moreover, they were younger. They could appreciate this in ways that I couldn't, that I could only learn from them. And to me, that's the proper learning model. You find the points of wisdom and learn where they are, and they can be about anywhere.
Well, do you think that economists should be reading classics like Adam Smith? I mean, most economists typically will read the latest issue of the AER, JPE, but they're not going to dip back into this older work. Is that a mistake?
Well, that's the reason why I've written this book that's coming out, Adam Smith's Theory of Society, because it's about 400 odd paragraphs, some of them quite long, paragraphs from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. There is a few from the Wealth of Nations and a few from the Lectures on Jurisprudence, because there's just really great ones there that you can't perfect for this book. But the vast majority of them are from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I have titles for each of those that really try to capture what is in that, what you're going to find in this paragraph. And then following that paragraph, I engage in a discussion. And I try to give that a modern twist. I try to give examples of learning that are relevant to today's world from that passage. And my hope is that people will actually read the original. And that's why so much of mine is just simply a quotation directly from Adam Smith. I think it's exciting reading.
Well, Vernon, thanks so much for joining me. Everybody check out the book Humanomics and Rationality in Economics. And we need more memoirs by economists, right? So we can see how discovery happens. Really appreciate it, and hope to talk again soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Unsiloed podcast produced by University FM. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review in your favorite listening app. To listen to our other episodes, please visit our website at www.unsiloedpodcast.com.